Hello everyone, welcome to the Physiotherapy tutorial channel. In the 10 minutes tutorial series, today we'll be discussing about the thoraco-dorsal fascia, also known as the thoraco-lumbar fascia. To understand it better, let us understand first the anatomy of the lumbar vertebrae. So in this diagrammatic representation, the side view of the lumbar spine typically shows a lumbar vertebrae. On the anterior side, you will see the body of the lumbar vertebrae, and on the posterior side, you will see the processes, the transverse as well as the spinous. The two vertebrae are separated by the intervertebral disc with the nucleus pulposus in the center, surrounded by the annulus fibrosus. So this is the typical lumbar vertebrae. There are 5 lumbar vertebrae which has the body on the anterior aspect as well as the processes on the posterior aspect. So that's the body. Intervertebral arch forming a intervertebral foramina for the spinal cord. Posterior side you have spinous process and transverse process on the sideways. Now lumbo-sacral spine usually play a central role in sustaining the postural stability of the body. However, lumbar spine alone is not capable of sustaining the normal loads which it carries daily. To stabilize the lumbar vertebrae on the sacral base, it actually requires the assistance of complex myofascial as well as the aponeurotic girdle. Now, this support is basically done by the thoraco-dorsal fascia. So primary stability of the lumbar spine, you can say that the ligaments supporting the individual lumbar vertebrae. However, if you have to classify the thoracodorsal fascia or in general fascia, these are of 4 types. Basically the superficial fascia, the deep fascia, the fascia which covers the internal organ which are called as the visceral fascia, and in the meninges in the central nervous system that is called as the meningeal fascia. Now superficial fascia itself has the 3 subtypes. The two which contains the adipose tissue and a layer separating them. The superficial fascia is also sometimes called as the panicular fascia. However, deep investing fascia which works in more close association to that of the muscle is typically of 2 types. To classify it is as the axial fascia and the appendicular fascia. One which covers around the trunk and the torso is basically a axial fascia. Now there are 2 types in it, hypaxial which means anterior and epimysium that means posterior. Now this in relation to that of the transverse process. So anything if you see anterior to the transverse process that hypaxial, anything posterior to the transverse process which has a blend of fascia covering the paraspinal muscle that is epaxial. So simplify, hypaxial anterior, epaxial posterior. Interconnection is basically called as the intermuscular septum. So that's basic anatomy of the thoracodorsal fascia. In the part 2 we are going to talk in detail about the layers of the thoracodorsal fascia. So fascia covering the anterior group of muscle is the hypaxial fascia. Fascia covering the posterior group of muscle that is the paraspinal is called the epaxial fascia. The interconnection between them at the transverse process level is basically the intermuscular septum. Now the fascia which covers the paraspinal muscle that is the epaxial fascia has basically 2 layers. The superficial layer coming from the transverse process towards the spinous is not continuous. However, the deepest layer of this posterior layer is continuous with that of the spinous process. This particular layer actually covers the erector spinae group of muscle. This fascial sheet which surrounds the paraspinal muscle is called as the paraspinal retinaculum sheet, PRS. Now let's see which all muscle composites the hypaxial as well as the epaxial. So we are taking here the lumbar L3 level, the transverse section. On the anterior side of the transverse process, you have the psoas major. On the lateral side, you will see a muscle which is quadratus lumborum. Anterior, you have rectus abdominis, and on the lateral side, you have the fascia which covers three muscles, the oblique and the transverse abdominis. So this is the external oblique, internal oblique, and the transverse abdominis. The fascial sheet that covers the three abdominal muscles are pretty thick enough and attached to the tip of the spinous process. This is the latissimus dorsi, the superficial layer on the lateral side. This entire investing fascia is the hypaxial fascia. So, so thoracodorsal fascia basically has three layers. We are going to talk about what forms the posterior layer. The posterior layer is divided into two. The superficial layer called as the superficial lamina and deep layer called as the deep lamina. Superficial lamina is formed by the extension of the outermost layer of the latissimus dorsi, which is thin, epimysium of the latissimus dorsi. The second subdivision layer, that is the superficial lamina, is a continuation of the aponeuroses of the latissimus dorsi. So in the superficial lamina is basically of two, composite of thin epimysium, the outermost layer, and aponeuroses. However, the deep lamina is what we have discussed earlier, is the sheet covering the erector spinae muscle, that is iliocostalis lumborum, semispinalis, and longissimus. This sheet is composite of the erector spinae, actually forms the deep lamina. This entire three subdivision is the posterior layer of the thoraco-dorsal fascia. Now we'll talk about the middle layer, which is thick out of all the three layers. So abdominal fascia, investing fascia, attaches to the tip of the transverse process, which is thick. Now if you go at the higher level, you will also see superficial layer composite of the serratus posterior inferior muscle. The extension of the fascia sheets get continuous with that of the PRS. So the deep lamina is continuous with that of the serratus posterior inferior and attached to the spinous process. So the fascia of SPI merge with the PRS. So when you talk about the middle layer of the thoracodorsal fascia, you have the investing fascia of the abdominal muscle, which is thick, forms the center layer. Then on the posterior side, you have the PRS, the one which covers the paraspinal. And on the anterior side, you have the investing fascia covering the quadratus lumborum. So this all three composite the middle layer of the fascia. However, anterior layer is the investing fascia which covers the quadratus lumborum and the psoas muscle. So basically thoracodorsal fascia has three layers: posterior, middle, and the anterior layer. Hope you like this video. Thank you for watching.